Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Books and Books. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're very happy to have you with us. We're very happy to have you here in the store with us. We're very happy to have those of you watching on the internet here with us as well. Again, as a quick reminder, if you can't make it to an event here at the bookstore, of course, we would prefer to have you here. You can always watch us on the internet. You can call us at the store. We can get a book signed for you that night of the event, and we'll ship it to you. On that event also, take a look at our Books and Books newsletter. This will give you a rundown of all the wonderful events we have at the bookstore every night of the week. A couple of note worth mentioning. Alexander McCall Smith will be joining us on Wednesday with his new book, The Minor Adjustment Bureau Beauty Salon. Ishmael Bea will be at the Gable store here in the 23rd of January. Arthur and Pauline Fromer, they have the Fromer Travel Guides. Hopefully they don't need any directions to get here. And we even have Isabel Allende will be joining us at the Wolfson campus downtown. We have tickets on sale for that. So again, pick up a copy of this. There's sure to be something here for everyone. And we look forward to getting your email on our mailing list. But I'm here in the capacity this evening to introduce our author for this evening. Patrick Alexander studied English and philosophy at Sussex University in the UK and moved to France in 1972. Where he married and raised a family. During the 30 years spent traveling the world as an international finance professional, Patrick never lost his love for the 19th century French literature. Trans-Pacific flights were never taken without a copy of Marcel Proust in his lap. Patrick resigned from his position as the Director of Professional Advancement and Director of the Wine Program at the University of Miami to concentrate on his writing full-time. His book, Marcel Proust, Search for Lost Time, was published by Vintage Books in September of 2009. His novel, The Nigerian Letter, was published in 2011. Patrick also teaches one of the best wine appreciation classes in the city of Miami right here at Books and Books. So if you're so inclined, go to our website and we'll give you more information on how to participate in that. But for this evening, please give a nice warm welcome to Mr. Patrick Alexander.
Thank you, Steve. That's not quite the way that Steve explained that to me earlier, because you know the book that we're can you hear me? Okay. The book we're looking at this evening, The Trip to Echo Spring, is about creative writers and alcohol, written by an English author. So I asked Steve, why did you invite me to do the introduction this evening? Is it because I'm English, or because of my reputation as a creative writer? He said, no, it's your reputation as an alcoholic. Oddly enough, and Olivia does some writing for The Guardian in London, and The Guardian just before Christmas in early December started an article on heroin, because heroin apparently is becoming chic again in Paris and in London. And basically the article, and it started a blog, and the conversation is continuing, does heroin enhance the creative spirit or detract? Would Alexander Trocchi or William Burroughs have written what they wrote without heroin? Would they have written better books? Would Charlie Parker make better music or worse music if he hadn't been addicted to heroin? And in many ways, obviously this book examines the same thing. Would Tennessee Williams, would Ernest Hemingway have written better books or worse books had they not been addicted to alcohol? But Olivia, in her book, goes much, much further than this. She wants to know, why did they drink? And she examines that. She examines the psychology. She examines the medical background of alcoholism. She examines the individual writer's family background, their psyches. And she really does want to know, why does an educated, intelligent, self-aware man who wakes up in the morning feeling his whole body trembling and his life falling apart and aching all over, by noon decide to go into a bar and start all over again? So she's really trying to explore that. And she explores it by traveling around America as an English outsider, looking at America and visiting all the places where these writers lived. So this book is also a travel book on America. The amazing thing about her, she has such passion for the 6 writers that she's chosen that she makes you want to go back and reread them yourself. But anyway, I'm not here to tell you about the book. We've got the author here, and she's going to tell you and do a much better job than I can. My job is to tell you something that I think Olivia won't tell you, because from what I can tell of her, she's far too modest. She's simply a fabulous writer. And to prove my point, I'm going to read 3 short excerpts. As I say, she travels around the country really pursuing these different writers. So she goes to New York because Tennessee Williams lived for a while in a hotel in Manhattan. And so she goes to Manhattan, she checks into a hotel, it's evening, she comes out, and it was the cocktail hour. That lovely moment, which in cinema is called magic time, the hour of the wolf. On its way to darkness, the sky had turned an astonishing deepening blue, flooding with colour as abruptly as if somebody had opened a sluice. In that instant, the city resembled a huge aquarium, the skyscrapers rising in the wavering light like underwater plants, the cabs flashing through the streets like shoals of fish, darting north at changeover as the lights tripped green all the way to Central Park. I don't know about you, but that's Manhattan. Then she travels to Baltimore, to a place where Scott Fitzgerald lived for a while. And she took the train to get there. By the time we reached Baltimore, the sun was very low in the sky. There were mountains of shale and aggregate and corrugated iron warehouses with burnt and smoke-stained panels. We shuddered by a line of derelict row houses. The bricks caved in like teeth. The shops were boarded up. I saw torn curtains in the windows, and between the buildings, cherry trees coming into bloom. And finally, my last little excerpt, on the way from New Orleans to Key West in search of Hemingway and Tennessee Williams again, she passes through our own Magic City. She stayed in the Red Roof Inn. The next morning, I collected the car. The day was overcast and very warm, and there were clouds of vultures circling the city. I drove out on Dixie Highway, past strip malls and strip joints, signs for psychic readings and computer repairs. Then the buildings thinned, and beyond the alligator fencing there was nothing but mangrove swamps and pools of standing water, where little white egrets dipped for fish. After a while, the land narrowed in like a neck, and there beyond the swamp was the sea. It was shallow and seamed with sandbars and deeper channels, the colours shifting musically from turquoise to green to a rich purple, like spilled grape juice. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm Miami welcome to Olivia Laing.
Thank you so much, Patrick. What a fantastic intro. Is my water safe? Yes. It's lovely to be back here. It's really lovely. I found Florida an incredibly bewitching place. I came to Miami and then I drove down to Key West and spent a while sort of unearthing elements of the lives of both Hemingway and Tennessee Williams, who are two of the writers that I concentrate on in this book. And I thought I'd say just a very little bit about it first, and then I'm going to read an extract that's from that Florida section that's about Hemingway, because I feel like it's appropriate to be talking about him when we're in a state that he loved so very much. So as Patrick said, this is a journey, this is a kind of biography, it has elements of memoir, and it really sets out to explore the relationship between writers and alcohol. And I grew up in an alcoholic family myself, and when I was 17, I read Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Tennessee Williams' incredible play. From that moment, I felt like it was the first thing I'd ever encountered that explained the dynamics of an alcoholic family, that broke through those sort of taboos of silence, denial, secrecy that anyone who's close to an alcoholic is hedged around by, is entrapped by. And so from that moment, I was really fascinated by what writers had to say about drinking. And as I got older, it began to dawn on me that writers who wrote about drinking, not always, but often, had themselves suffered from alcoholism. So there seemed to be these sort of complex patterns going on between the lives and the work. And I wanted to get to the bottom of that. I wanted to make sense of that. I wanted to understand both why writers drink and to use their work to understand why anyone drinks, and also to see what this influence of spirits had upon the body of literature itself. So I think I'll start reading now, and we can open to questions afterwards. There were rocking chairs at Charlotte Airport, and one of the concession stands sold barbecue. The flight to Miami was delayed, and by the time we boarded it was already evening. The runway was marked out in glowing dots of green and blue and larger splashes of red, the dark bulk of the city beyond a scattering of gold. A swift sense of pressure in the feet, then we were up in wispy cloud the colour of smoke, and then out into the unencumbered ink blue of night. I had a sense of being cut loose from all my body's usual routines, and yet I was deeply relaxed, both physically and in my heart. We were circling back to the south now, to Florida, that swampy, subtropical peninsula where the rich come to luxuriate and the poor to make their fortunes. Hemingway country. There are many regions of America associated with Hemingway, among them Michigan, Wyoming and Idaho, but Florida, or rather the ocean that surrounds it, is where he spent some of his happiest days, fishing for marlin from his black-hulled boat Pilar, all the friends he could muster aboard. Florida was the first place he came to after Europe, and he remained based there throughout the decade of his marriage to Pauline Pfeiffer. They left Paris together in March 1928. Pauline was 6 months pregnant, and in an endearing letter to his new wife written aboard ship, he expressed the impatient hope that they would soon stop bouncing around on the bloody Atlantic. Only let's hurry and get to Havana and to Key West and then settle down and not get in any Royal Mail steam packets anymore. The end is weak, but so is Papa. In Key West, they took an apartment while waiting for their new Ford, a present from Pauline's rich Uncle Gus. On the morning of the 10th of April, an unexpected reunion occurred. A few weeks back, Hemingway's parents had written to him in Paris, telling him of their upcoming holiday in St. Petersburg. The letter hadn't yet recrossed the Atlantic, and so Hemingway had no idea his parents were nearby, while they assumed he was still in France. Partway through their vacation, they'd gone to Havana for an excursion. They were coming back into Key West on the ferry when Hemingway's father spotted a hunched-up figure fishing on the pier. Like Vasya in Chekhov's story The Steppe, who can see hares washing themselves with their paws and bustards preening their wings, Dr. Clarence Edmonds Hemingway was blessed with remarkably good vision. Recognising his son's stocky form, he whistled like a bobwhite, the familial call. Ernest jumped up and ran to meet them. Grace, the all-American bitch, was glowing, but Ed had lost weight and looked old and exhausted, his neck scrawny inside the wing-collar shirt he always wore. All the same, he was delighted to see his son. Like a dream, he wrote a day or two later, to think of our joyous greeting. Hemingway rushed his parents off to meet Pauline, though neither had been exactly thrilled when they heard of his divorce. "Oh, Ernest, how could you leave Hadley and Bumby?" his father had written on 8th of August 1927. "I fell in love with Bumby, and I'm so proud of him, and you his father." According to Ernest's sisters Marceline's soapy and not always reliable memoir At the Hemingways, their surprise encounter went some way to salving this wound. "Daddy wiped a tear from his eye as he told me about it," she wrote. "This meeting with Ernest meant so much to our parents, especially to Dad, for he'd missed Ernest during the estrangement." There's a photo of the two Hemingway men taken that afternoon, standing by a flashy car that looks black against the sun. Ernest is leaning into it in socks and light trousers, a jaunty argyle vest and a shirt so white his shoulders merge in with the sky. His hands are clasped in front of him, and he looks both naughty and angelic, smiling knowingly at the photographer, his dark hair brill-creamed back. There's a little dark object under his arm that resembles a hot water bottle cover, a sweater, perhaps. Dr. Hemingway isn't looking at the camera. He's turned to gaze intently at his son. He's wearing a three-piece suit and tie, warm clothes for the climate, and holding in his hands a sailor's cap. His nose and chin look very sharp, eyes deeply set, just like the famous description of Dr. Adams, the man he both was and wasn't, that would soon appear in Fathers and Sons. It's all there. The big frame, the quick movements, the wide shoulders, the hooked hawk nose, the beard that covered the weak chin, the famous eyes that saw as a big-horn ram or an eagle sees, literally. If you'd asked Ernest, he'd say Nick Adams, the father in the Nick Adams... He'd say Dr. Adams, the father in the Nick Adams story, bore no resemblance to Dr. Hemingway beyond the coincidence of their professions, their place of residence, and the miracle of their vision. In fact, 3 years back, he'd written his father a letter explaining just that. "I'm so glad you liked the doctor story," he said. "I've written a number of stories about the Michigan country. The country is always true. What happens in the stories is fiction." Maybe. Maybe not. In a letter written in 1930 to Max Perkins, he changed his tune, saying of In Our Times, "The reason most of the book seems so true is because most of it is true, and I had no skill then, nor have much now, at changing names and circumstances. Regret this very much." After that week in Florida, Hemingway only saw his father once more. In October 1928, a few weeks after the birth of his son Patrick, he visited his parents in what had been his boyhood home, 600 North Kenilworth Avenue, Oak Park, Illinois, the house his mother had both designed and paid for. During the visit, Ed seemed tired, irritable, and not at all well, though he didn't discuss the worries that had begun to bear down on him like a ton of bricks. He'd planned on retiring to a practice in Florida and had bought up land during the real estate boom as an investment. But now the crash was underway, and his finances, as well as his health, were precarious. He'd been diagnosed with angina pectoris and diabetes, a touch of the sugar, as he told his colleagues. After Hemingway left, Ed wrote him a brief, fond note. In with the letter was another envelope addressed to my son. Inside there was a poem written in Ed's slanting hand. "I can't seem to think of a way to say what I'd most like to say to my very dear son, whose book is just done, except give him my love and hooray." He put the same old quotation marks around the word Dad in the letter too. A month went by. Then on the 6th of December, he woke with a pain in his foot. The doctor in him immediately foresaw diabetic neuropathy, gangrene, amputation, an unspooling ticker tape of grim eventuality. In pain and increasingly frantic about an unpayable debt, he told Grace that he was scared. She suggested he talk to a doctor, but he didn't. He went out and returned to the house before noon, going down to the basement, where he burned a few papers. Then he called up to his wife that he was tired and would rest before lunch. He went into his bedroom, closed the door, and shot himself in the right temple with his father's .32 caliber Smith & Wesson. At that moment, Hemingway was eating lunch in the Brevoort Hotel in Manhattan, where 10 years later John Cheever would drink whole afternoons away. His companion was his 5-year-old son Bumby, who just arrived from Paris. After lunch, they went to Penn Station and boarded the Havana Special to Key West. Just outside Trenton, a porter delivered a telegram from Oak Park. It read, "Father died this morning. Arrange to stop here if possible." Reeling, he got off the train at Philadelphia, leaving his small son to travel on in the care of the porter. He only had $40 in cash, not enough to get home. He telegrammed his editor, Max Perkins, asking him to wire money by way of Western Union. Then, figuring Max had probably already left the office, he telephoned Scott Fitzgerald, who was living at the time in Delaware. Scott answered the phone immediately agreed. A few days later, Hemingway wrote from Oak Park, "You were damned good and also bloody effective to get me that money. My father shot himself, as I suppose you may have read in the papers. We'll send you the $100 as soon as I reach Key West. I was fond as hell of my father, and feel too punk, also sick, etc., to write a letter, but wanted to say thank you. Punk, a word a woodsman might use to describe a tree that's rotten, that looks all right until you realise you can tear into it with your bare hands. To Max Perkins, a week later, he added more details. Various worthless land in Michigan, Florida, etc., with taxes to pay on all of it. No other capital. All gone. He had angina pectoris and diabetes, preventing him from getting any more insurance. Sunk all his savings, my grandfather's estate, etc., in Florida, hadn't been able to sleep with pain, etc., knocked him temporarily out of his head. Dr. Hemingway, who sometimes washed his son's mouth out with soap, who sometimes beat him with a razor strop, who was sometimes implacable, turned temper on a halfpenny, who drove into his boy a principle of honour and sportsmanship that never wholly left him, who passed on from hand to hand those nourishing loves for the Michigan woods, for clear water, jacksnipe, wild geese, dead grass, new corn, deserted orchards, cider mills, and open fires. Open your mouth, boy. One more stone to swallow down. So that is actually quite an upsetting extract from The Trip to Echo Spring. And these sort of stories just recur over and over, these kind of losses, these kind of blows struck. And while I take pains to not use them as excuses for these men's drinking, they're certainly part of the story, they're certainly part of what's happening. And Hemingway lost his father as an adult, as a father himself. John Berryman, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, who I also examine in the book, his father shot himself in Florida when he was a very small boy, in fact, just outside the window of the house that John was sleeping in. And those kind of losses matter, I think. Those kind of losses are relevant. And I'm asked a lot what causes alcoholism, why do writers drink? And it remains a mystery. It remains a mysterious thing to answer. We know that it's 50% genetic. That's definite. We know that childhood circumstances have a lot to do with it. We know that personality types might play a part in it. But the actual answer remains to be unfolded, and I think it's personal for each different person. Having said that, I think that there are commonalities in all of these men. So the people I look at are F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, John Cheever, Tennessee Williams, Raymond Carver and Tennessee Williams. And for all of them, you can see that there are ways in which both childhood damage, unhappy childhoods, and a kind of anxiety, a kind of social unease, a kind of depression play a big part as well. And they're using alcohol as a way of self-medicating against those things. Maybe I can just tell a couple of little stories about that as well. I look at the early stages of drinking at the beginning of the book, where people start to drink. And this really interested me because people like Tennessee Williams and like John Cheever in particular really suffered from very high levels of anxiety. And if you look at Tennessee Williams before he became Tennessee, when he was still Tom Williams, he was a good-looking, nervous kid. He had a father that he despised and a mother that he found completely overbearing. He adored his sister, and his sister was going mad at the time. And he suffered from these appalling panic attacks. He suffered from terrifying panic attacks. He would run out of the house and roam the streets. He'd go and swim lengths in the pool in this sort of attempt to work off the unease he was feeling. He often felt that he was going to go mad. And this is as a young boy. This is sort of as a teenager. When he had his first drink, which we know exactly what that was, it was a creme de menthe on a ship going to Paris from New York, and he immediately threw up. That was his first sort of reaction to alcohol. The next few drinks along, though, he started to realise this is a magical substance. This is a substance that is able to quell my anxiety, is able to make me feel magically buoyant, magically capable. And I think that ability of alcohol, which is to do with its effects on brain chemistry, is very, very important, because those first experiences make you think that if I keep taking this, I will never feel those painful feelings again. The problem, of course, is that alcohol is addictive and it's a poison. So what happens to the brain is that you take a drink and you experience a cessation in all of this brain chatter, but you drink more and more and the brain produces more and more of it. So when you stop, the feelings that you were trying to suppress come back on you tenfold. They're much, much more powerful. So you need to drink more and more and more in order to keep the effects that you desire. And alcohol has profoundly detrimental effects on the brain, on the body, and on the architecture of the outer life. So as I travelled across the country, I was looking at the ways in which those sort of fun, early, intoxicating drinking experiences, the kind of thing that you see in The Great Gatsby, say, or Tender is the Night, where it's all just blissful and beautiful and romantic, where they start to curdle and where they start to become much more dangerous. And this is where you get the Tennessee Williams of the later plays, midlife Tennessee Williams, in what he described as his stoned age, where his partner had died. He was drinking himself silly. He could barely walk through a room. He'd fall over constantly. And people often ask me, is alcohol creative? Does alcohol produce creativity? And it long-term absolutely doesn't. And I think Tennessee Williams' life is such an example of that his work becomes increasingly damaged by alcohol, increasingly chaotic. His life is increasingly unhappy, and you just get this litany, appalling litany of failures. So his plays start to have less audiences, people stop wanting to put them on, the critics turn on him, he carries on producing work, but it's to smaller and smaller audiences, and he keeps experiencing these successive failures, which he finds profoundly wounding. And what does he do? He has another drink, because that's what he knows to do. This is sounding like a very bleak book at the moment. It's not, I don't think, because my own experiences as a child were with somebody who managed to recover from drinking, and so I knew recovery was possible. I knew it didn't have to be like that. And I end up, as I travel across the country, in Port Angeles on the west coast, and I look there at the recoveries of John Cheever and Raymond Carver, who were friends with each other. They taught together at Iowa, and they both managed to get sober. And furthermore, they both managed to carry on producing work, because another question that comes up a lot is, if you stop drinking, don't you just lose it all? Don't you lose your creativity? And that didn't happen for either of them. So where the book comes to rest, I suppose, is with what Raymond Carver described as his second life. He had drunk very hard through his first 30, 40 years. And he'd had a family very young, he'd married very young, he was very poor. At some point he realised that he was making a wasteland out of his life. That's his word for it, a wasteland. And he decided to stop, and that wasn't very easy, it took a long time, but he managed to stop. And in his sobriety, he produced the most extraordinary body of work, which was a series of poems and a series of short stories that are radiant with hopefulness, with gratitude, with appreciation, because he felt that he had been granted this reprieve. He felt that everything he had, this is another quote from him, was gravy. And that to me is astonishing, and that, I hope, is one of the messages of the book, that it is possible to stop. And maybe I'll stop there.
Folks, if anyone has a question for the author, please allow me to present you with this microphone so that they can hear you on the internet. You will not be able to be heard throughout the story.
Yeah, sure.
Anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
Sorry, the obvious question, I think I know the answer is you're an English author, but you've picked American writers. But I think the answer is that you didn't pick English authors, partly because there aren't so many drunken English authors, and partly because it's a travel book and therefore you can. But the big question is, why didn't you address Malcolm Lowry, who's the biggest drinker of them all, and his book is...
Yeah, Under the Volcano. So the question was, why did I pick American writers? Why no Malcolm Lowry? I'll answer the first one first. There are British drinkers. There's Kingsley Amis, there's Louis MacNeice, there's the Welshman Dylan Thomas. There were plenty of people. I felt that the real myth of writers and drinking it seemed to me an American story. And perhaps more than that, the writers that I most loved were Americans. And it was very important to me that this was a book about writers I loved, because I'm presenting so much dark material about their lives, shameful material about their lives. I really wanted to have, in relief to that, a genuine love of their work, to show them in the full range of their humanity. Malcolm Lowry, it is an extraordinary book. It just these were 6 people that really spoke to me, that I really felt like I wanted to spend a couple of years with, and a lot of that couple of years was unpleasant because I'm looking at really unpleasant behaviour. So it needed to be writing that not only I thought was great, but that kind of connected on a heart level, and that these were the guys. It was quite clear early on.
Talking about, it seems to me what's kind of remarkable is that they were able to create toward the end of their lives some good work, any good work, and some of them had very sort of miserable endings, like Berryman and Hemingway, and just the fact that he could write A Movable Feast sort of toward the end of his life. And Berryman could still teach at the University of Iowa, and he had some students who responded very wonderfully to him.
Yeah.
How were they able to conduct their lives, drinking as they did?
That is such a good question. How were they able to keep producing work towards the end of their lives? They didn't just produce good work, let's say that first. So A Movable Feast is absolutely extraordinary, but A Movable Feast, which was published posthumously after Hemingway committed suicide, it's based very heavily on notebooks that Hemingway found buried in the Ritz Hotel. He'd left them in suitcases in the 1920s, and they were given back to him much, much later. So suddenly he was sort of plunged back into this immediacy of his Paris young days. And I think a lot of their sort of freshness and purity comes from that, because there are other Hemingway books written before that you can feel the influence of alcohol. You can see that things are getting sloppy, that there are sentences that the young Hemingway would never have permitted. I'm thinking of Across the River and Into the Trees, which I actually really like, but it is incredibly repetitive, and you can see that that's a drunkard's repetitiveness. There's something in that it's got a liquidity to it that isn't controlled, I think. What was the other one you said? Berryman being able to teach. Yeah, Berryman, John Berryman, who is such a marvellous poet. The Dream Songs are marvellous. Homage to Mistress Bradstreet, I think, is absolutely extraordinary. His later poetry gets quite self-indulgent and self-pitying, which are also marks of the drunkard. Having said that, he wrote his unfinished novel, Recovery, about his experiences in recovery, which is the most, if you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. It's a terrifying, witty, bleak, very funny book about recovery, based very closely. It's a semi-fictionalized version of his own experiences in recovery. And you just rattle through it, and suddenly it comes to an end. And it comes to an end because he jumped off a bridge and killed himself, which is, I think that's the answer, really. You can't sustain creativity in those sort of conditions. Hi. Mike coming.
What is it about their work as writers that link them with alcoholism as opposed to construction workers that are alcoholics? or anybody that's an alcoholic.
Say that again. What is it?
What is it about
Why
about them as writers
that makes their alcoholism different?
precisely?
That's a really good question as well. I think in some ways, what makes it different is absolutely nothing. A drunk is a drunk is a drunk. I think there's a lot that's absolutely the same in anyone. That said, I think there are particular reasons why a writer might turn to drinking, and I'm sure there are particular reasons why a construction worker might turn to drinking as well, but I can't answer those because I haven't spent time on it, but I can tell you a bit about why a writer does. And I think, and let me be very clear that these aren't excuses for drinking, but these are just part of the picture. I think writers work in total isolation. They're making up a dream world in their head, and they're doing that day after day alone in a room. At the end of that process, they are flung out into the world, and what they've produced is scrutinised, criticised, and as they get more and more successful, that's done in an incredibly public way. And we know that Hemingway found that process incredibly painful. He'd call the critics jackals, and he felt like they were tearing him apart. Tennessee Williams suffered really badly at the hands of critics for a very long time. Once they turned on him really viciously, and they'd say things like, "This play is like getting a message from a white dwarf. There's nothing there but cinders." Imagine somebody saying that to you, and then imagine going away and carrying on writing, not for 1 day or 2 days, but for another 20 years. I think those sort of pressures are certainly part of the picture, but that doesn't mean that they're not capable of stopping drinking as well. It's not enough of an excuse, but it's certainly part of it. One there and one there.
Yeah. Hi. I been talking about the book. I heard it on PBS. I heard you. So, and then I've seen it over at the this bookstore over at the beach. And my mind isn't that great, so I don't remember. But I've been quoting that you named it after I originally thought I read or heard that it was from The Glass Menagerie. I don't know where I heard
Cat on a Hot Tin Roof.
I'm sorry?
Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Are you going to say the title?
Somewhere somebody said it was. Yeah, it was Glass Menagerie, and I had just seen that in New York. But at any rate, all that said, so I've been saying, well, it's called the Back 40, and it's his euphemism. It's Tennessee Williams' euphemism for getting drunk, going on a bender, or just going from sober to. And I wondered if I said to people that a lot of my friends that don't read as much as I do, I said, well, probably. I said probably it came from, and that's my question to you. Do you know where it came from? In his childhood, was there a place that was that place this spring? I can't see. That's the thing. I can tell
you the trip to Echo Spring. I can tell you exactly where it comes from.
Was such a place exist in his childhood? And I was just curious about that. How that came about.
I will tell you. In the play Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, it's about a family of rich Southerners, and the son, Brick, who is a retired sports hero, who's played by Paul Newman in the film. He is on crutches. He's been messing around on the sports field drunk, and he keeps going to the liquor cabinet, and his wife, Maggie the cat, who's played by Elizabeth Taylor in the film, says, "Brick, what are you doing? Where are you going?" And he says, "I'm making a little short trip to Echo Spring." And Echo Spring is actually a brand of Kentucky bourbon. You can buy it in a store. But Tennessee Williams chose that rather than any other brand of bourbon. He didn't choose, Maker's Mark. And I think he chose it because he wanted to express that symbolic place that drink takes us to, that symbolic place where one goes. And so it seemed to me this incredibly sort of boiled down version of the drinker's journey is the trip to Echo Spring. And yeah, I love it. I can see why somebody would want to go there, and at the same time, it's a trip that has consequences. It's a trip that has costs.
Hi. I just wanted to ask you, what did you find in terms of the writer's recognition of their own addiction, and did they also, truly believe that it helped their writing?
What did I find in terms of the writer's recognition? Yeah, that varies day to day almost, depending on how they're feeling about it. So some of them knew that they were in big trouble, and if you read John Cheever's journals, which are a massive, massive body of work, they've been published as a book like that, but there are actually tons of them. There is this ongoing drama about him knowing that he is in deep trouble with alcohol. He's constantly writing, it's 10 a.m. in the morning. If I can just last out till 11, that would be great. It's 10:30 a.m. I've been to the kitchen. My wife's doing the ironing. I can't get into the pantry to get the gin bottles. I can hear them singing. He'll literally say that. So then he'll jump in the car and he'll go to the liquor store. He'll buy a bottle of gin. He'll drive down a back street and he'll suckle at the bottle, spilling it all over himself. He knows. He's a smart guy. He knows that he's in trouble. But then there are all the excuses and the evasions and the desire to keep it going. So there are those moments of clarity and then moments of less clarity. For somebody like Hemingway, there is an awful lot of denial. It's very rare that he admits it. The point when he really does is when he's writing A Movable Feast, and at that time, throughout the book, he talks about how bad Fitzgerald is as a drinker, what a sloppy drunk Fitzgerald is, and what a good drinker Hemingway is, that he can take his liquor, he understands how to drink, he's like a European. This sort of real self-aggrandizing about himself. What's interesting, what I discovered as I was working on it, is that at the time that he was writing that, he had been put on an alcohol-free diet by his doctor. He had liver disease, his doctor thought he was going to die, and he made him stop drinking. And there are extraordinary letters that he wrote where he says, I can't do this. I can't cope without this. All my life, when things got bad, I had a glass of wine and they got better, and now I haven't got it. So he was really confronting that he had become an alcoholic. And yet, at the same time, he's writing this book, which is the most extraordinary document of denial. And I think that sort of sums up the kind of honesty with which people will examine their own drinking.
Folks,
Was there
we have
one?
time for one
There
more.
was one there as well. Oh,
Mine is a very tiny question, and maybe you can take two questions. But my tiny question is, could you talk a little about that great scene on the ferry from Havana to Key West where father sees son? How did you get that?
where father sees son. Yeah, I think that was a combination of bits from biographies, bits from letters, kind of piecing together who was there when. There's an amazing 4-part Hemingway biography, and now I've completely blanked who it's by, but that's an incredible source for that sort of stuff. It's almost like a novel. It's written in a really interesting way. If you come up to me later, I'll find the reference in the book. Do we have time for that one that was there?
What your opinion is about the role of bars or clubs and drinking in contrast to the writer drinking while writing, those two kinds of
good point.
situations
Yeah,
of drinking
because
in the writer's lives.
That's about where people drink, the locations in which people drink, and whether that's different. I should have said this earlier probably, the big myth about writers and drinking is that they're drinking as they're writing, and that actually tends not to be true. It tends to be something that happens outside of the writing day, and I think, at least initially for all these writers, that was something about sociability as well. So it would be happening in bars. It wasn't often at home, or it would be with other people at home. Later on, when we're talking about those kind of John Cheever stories, it would be much more private. But I think the desire for sociability and the desire for drinking go hand in hand for a while, and as the alcoholism develops, they tend to sort of pull apart much more again. Okay, so I think we're out of time. Thank you so much. You've been a lovely audience.
Thank you so much. Folks, of course, the books are for sale behind the counter. If you buy 5 copies apiece, the author will sign them for you right up here. Thank you so much for coming. You can buy one.
Where do you want me?